This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gods of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior. Chapter 9. ISSUS, Goddess of Life Eternal. The confession of love which the girl's fright had wrung from her touched me deeply, but it humiliated me as well, since I felt that in some thoughtless word or act I had given her reason to believe that I reciprocated her affection. Never have I been much of a ladies' man, being more concerned with fighting and kindred arts which have ever seemed to me more befitting a man than mooning over a scented glove 4 sizes too small for him, or kissing a dead flower that has begun to smell like a cabbage. So I was quite at a loss as to what to do or say. 1,000 times rather face the wild hordes of the Dead Sea bottoms than meet the eyes of this beautiful young girl and tell her the thing that I must tell her. But there was nothing else to be done, and so I did it, very clumsily too, I fear. Gently I unclasped her hands from about my neck, and still holding them in mine I told her the story of my love for Dejah Thoris, that of all the women of 2 worlds that I had known and admired during my long life, she alone had I loved. The tale did not seem to please her. Like a tigress she sprang, panting, to her feet. Her beautiful face was distorted in an expression of horrible malevolence. Her eyes fairly blazed into mine. "Dog!" she hissed. "Dog of a blasphemer! Think you that Fedor, daughter of Matai Shang, supplicates? She commands. What to her is your puny outer world passion for the vile creature you choose in your other life? Fedor has glorified you with her love, and you have spurned her. 10,000 unthinkably atrocious deaths could not atone for the affront that you have put upon me. The thing that you call Dejah Thoris shall die, the most horrible of them all. You have sealed the warrant for her doom. And you shall be the meanest slave in the service of the goddess you have attempted to humiliate. Tortures and ignominies shall be heaped upon you until you grovel at my feet, asking the boon of death. In my gracious generosity I shall at length grant your prayer, and from the high balcony of the golden cliffs I shall watch the great white apes tear you asunder." She had it all fixed up, the whole lovely program from start to finish. It amazed me to think that one so divinely beautiful could at the same time be so fiendishly vindictive. It occurred to me, however, that she had overlooked one little factor in her revenge, and so, without any intent to add to her discomfiture, but rather to permit her to rearrange her plans along more practical lines, I pointed to the nearest porthole. Evidently she had entirely forgotten her surroundings and her present circumstances, for a single glance at the dark swirling waters without sent her crumpled upon a low bench, where with her face buried in her arms she sobbed more like a very unhappy little girl than a proud and all-powerful goddess. Down we continued to sink until the heavy glass of the portholes became noticeably warm from the heat of the water without. Evidently we were very far beneath the surface crust of Mars. Presently our downward motion ceased, and I could hear the propellers swirling through the water at our stern and forcing us ahead at high speed. It was very dark down there, but the light from our portholes and the reflection from what must have been a powerful searchlight on the submarine's nose showed that we were forging through a narrow passage, rock-lined and tube-like. After a few minutes the propellers ceased their whirling. We came to a full stop, and then commenced to rise swiftly toward the surface. Soon the light from without increased, and we came to a stop. Exeter entered the cabin with his men. "Come," he said, and we followed him through the hatchway which had been opened by one of the seamen. We found ourselves in a small subterranean vault, in the center of which was the pool in which lay our submarine, floating as we had first seen her with only her black back showing. Around the edge of the pool was a level platform, and then the walls of the cave rose perpendicularly for a few feet to arch toward the center of the low roof. The walls about the ledge were pierced with a number of entrances to dimly lighted passageways. Toward one of these our captors led us, and after a short walk halted before a steel cage which lay at the bottom of a shaft rising above us as far as one could see. The cage proved to be one of the common types of elevator cars that I had seen in other parts of Barsoom. They are operated by means of enormous magnets which are suspended at the top of the shaft. By an electrical device the volume of magnetism generated is regulated and the speed of the car varied. In long stretches they move at a sickening speed, especially on the upward trip, since the small force of gravity inherent to Mars's results in very little opposition to the powerful force above. Scarcely had the door of the car closed behind us than we were slowing up to stop at the landing above, so rapid was our ascent of the long shaft. When we emerged from the little building which houses the upper terminus of the elevator, we found ourselves in the midst of a veritable fairyland of beauty. The combined languages of earthmen hold no words to convey to mind the gorgeous beauties of the scene. One may speak of scarlet sward and ivory-stemmed trees decked with brilliant purple blooms, of winding walks paved with crushed rubies, with emerald, with turquoise, even with diamonds themselves, of a magnificent temple of burnished gold, hand-wrought with marvelous designs. But where are the words to describe the glorious colors that are unknown to earthly eyes? Where the mind or the imagination that can grasp the gorgeous scintillations of unheard-of rays as they emanate from the thousand nameless jewels of Barsoom? Even my eyes, for long years accustomed to the barbaric splendors of a Martian jedik's court, were amazed at the glory of the scene. Fedor's eyes were wide in amazement. "The temple of ISSUS," she whispered, half to herself. Exeter watched us with his grim smile, partly of amusement and partly malicious gloating. The garden swarmed with brilliantly trapped black men and women. Among them moved red and white females, serving their every want. The places of the outer world and the temples of the Therns had been robbed of their princesses and goddesses, that the blacks might have their slaves. Through this scene we moved toward the temple. At the main entrance we were halted by a cordon of armed guards. Exeter spoke a few words to an officer, who came forward to question us. Together they entered the temple, where they remained for some time. When they returned, it was to announce that ISSUS desired to look upon the daughter of Matai Shang, and the strange creature from another world who had been a prince of Helium. Slowly we moved through the endless corridors of unthinkable beauty, through magnificent apartments and noble halls. At length we were halted in a spacious chamber in the center of the temple. One of the officers who had accompanied us advanced to a large door in the further end of the chamber. Here he must have made some sort of signal, for immediately the door opened and another richly trapped courier emerged. We were then led up to the door, where we were directed to get down on our hands and knees, with our backs toward the room we were to enter. The doors were swung open, and after being cautioned not to turn our heads under penalty of instant death, we were commanded to back into the presence of ISSUS. Never have I been in so humiliating a position in my life, and only my love for Dejah Thoris and the hope which still clung to me that I might again see her kept me from rising to face the goddess of the firstborn and go down to my death like a gentleman, facing my foes with their blood mingling with mine. After we had crawled in this disgusting fashion for a matter of a couple of 100 feet, we were halted by our escort. "Let them rise," said a voice behind us, a thin, wavering voice, yet one that had evidently been accustomed to command for many years. "Rise," said our escort, "but do not face toward ISSUS." "The woman pleases me," said the thin, wavering voice again after a few moments of silence. "She shall serve me the allotted time. The man you may return to the Isle of SHADOR, which lies against the northern shore of the Sea of Omin. Let the woman turn and look upon ISSUS, knowing that those of the lower orders who gaze upon the holy vision of her radiant face survive the blinding glory but a single year." I watched Fedor from the corner of my eye. She paled to a ghastly hue. Slowly, very slowly, she turned, as though drawn by some invisible yet irresistible force. She was standing quite close to me, so close that her bare arm touched mine as she finally faced ISSUS, goddess of life eternal. I could not see the girl's face, as her eyes rested for the first time on the supreme deity of Mars, but felt the shudder that ran through her in the trembling flesh of the arm that touched mine. It must be dazzling loveliness indeed, thought I, to cause such emotion in the breast of so radiant a beauty as Fedor, daughter of Matai Shang. "Let the woman remain. Remove the man. Go." Thus spoke ISSUS, and the heavy hand of the officer fell upon my shoulder. In accordance with his instructions, I dropped to my hands and knees once more and crawled from the presence. It had been my first audience with deity, but I am free to confess that I was not greatly impressed. other than with the ridiculous figure I cut scrambling about on my marrow bones. Once without the chamber, the doors closed behind us, and I was bid to rise. Exeter joined me, and together we slowly retraced our steps toward the gardens. "You spared my life when you easily might have taken it," he said, after we had proceeded some little way in silence, "and I would aid you if I might. I can help to make your life here more bearable, but your fate is inevitable. You may never hope to return to the outer world." "What will be my fate?" I asked. "That will depend largely upon ISSUS. So long as she does not send for you and reveal her face to you, you may live on for years in as mild a form of bondage as I can arrange for you." "Why should she send for me?" I asked. "The men of the lower orders she often uses for various purposes of amusement. Such a fighter as you, for example, would render fine sport in the monthly rites of the temple. There are men pitted against men and against beasts for the edification of ISSUS and the replenishment of her ladder." "She eats human flesh?" I asked, not in horror, however, for since my recently acquired knowledge of the holy Therns, I was prepared for anything in this still less accessible heaven, where all was evidently dictated by a single omnipotence, where ages of narrow fanaticism and self-worship had eradicated all the broader humanitarian instincts that the race might once have possessed. They were a people drunk with power and success, looking upon the other inhabitants of Mars as we look upon the beasts of the field and the forest. Why then should they not eat of the flesh of the lower orders, whose lives and characters they know more understood than do we the inmost thoughts and sensibilities of the cattle we slaughter for our earthly tables? She eats only the flesh of the best bred of the holy Therns and the red Barsoomians. The flesh of the others goes to our boards. The animals are eaten by the slaves. She also eats other dainties." I did not understand then that there lay any special significance in his reference to other dainties. I thought the limit of ghoulishness already had been reached in the recitation of ISSUS's menu. I still had much to learn as to the depths of cruelty and bestiality to which omnipotence may drag its possessor. We had about reached the last of the many chambers and corridors which led to the gardens when an officer overtook us. "ISSUS would look again upon this man," he said. "The girl has told her that he is of wondrous beauty, and of such prowess that alone he slew 7 of the firstborn, and with his bare hands took Exeter captive, binding him with his own harness." Exeter looked uncomfortable. Evidently he did not relish the thought that ISSUS had learned of his inglorious defeat. Without a word he turned, and we followed the officer once again to the closed doors before the audience chamber of ISSUS, goddess of life eternal. Here the ceremony of entrance was repeated. Again ISSUS bid me rise. For several minutes all was silent as the tomb. The eyes of deity were appraising me. Presently the thin wavering voice broke the stillness, repeating in a sing-song drone the words which for countless ages had sealed the doom of numberless victims. "Let the man turn and look upon ISSUS, knowing that those of the lower orders who gaze upon the holy vision of her radiant face survive the blinding glory but a single year." I turned as I had been bid, expecting such a treat as only the revealment of divine glory to mortal eyes might produce. What I saw was a solid phalanx of armed men between myself and a dais supporting a great bench of carved sapphirus wood. On this bench or throne squatted a female black. She was evidently very old. Not a hair remained upon her wrinkled skull. With the exception of 2 yellow fangs, she was entirely toothless. On either side of her thin, hawk-like nose, her eyes burned from the depths of horribly sunken sockets. The skin of her face was seamed and creased with 1,000,000 deep-cut furrows. Her body was as wrinkled as her face, and as repulsive. Emaciated arms and legs, attached to a torso which seemed to be mostly distorted abdomen, completed the holy vision of her radiant beauty. Surrounding her were a number of female slaves, among them Fedor, white and trembling. "This is the man who slew 7 of the firstborn, and barehanded bound Dator Exeter with his own harness?" asked ISSUS. "Most glorious vision of divine loveliness it is," replied the officer, who stood at my side. "Produce Dator Exeter," she commanded. Exeter was brought from the adjoining room. ISSUS glared at him, a baleful light in her hideous eyes. "And such as you are a Dator of the firstborn?" she squealed.
"For the disgrace you have brought upon the immortal race, you shall be degraded to a rank below the lowest. No longer be you a dator, but forevermore a slave of slaves, to fetch and carry for the lower orders that serve in the gardens of ISSUS. Remove his harness. Cowards and slaves wear no trappings."
Exedar stood stiffly erect. Not a muscle twitched, nor a tremor shook his giant frame as a soldier of the guard roughly stripped his gorgeous trappings from him.
"Begone!" screamed the infuriated little old woman. "Begone! But instead of the light of the gardens of ISSUS, let you serve as a slave of this slave, who conquered you in the prison on the Isle of SHADOR in the Sea of Omin. Take him away, out of the sight of my divine eyes."
Slowly and with high-held head, the proud Exedar turned and stalked from the chamber. ISSUS rose and turned to leave the room by another exit. Turning to me, she said,
"You shall be returned to SHADOR for the present. Later ISSUS will see the manner of your fighting. Go."
Then she disappeared, followed by her retinue. Only Fedor lagged behind, and as I started to follow my guard toward the gardens, the girl came running after me. "Oh, do not leave me in this terrible place," she begged. "Forgive the things I said to you, my prince. I did not mean them. Only take me away with you. Let me share your imprisonment on SHADOR." Her words were an almost incoherent volley of thoughts, so rapidly she spoke. "You did not understand the honor that I did you. Among the Therns there is no marriage or giving in marriage, as among the lower orders of the outer world. We might have lived together for ever in love and happiness. We have both looked upon ISSUS, and in a year we die. Let us live that year at least together in what measure of joy remains for the doomed." "If it was difficult for me to understand you, Fedor," I replied, "can you not understand that possibly it is equally difficult for you to understand the motives, the customs, and the social laws that guide me? I do not wish to hurt you, nor to seem to undervalue the honor which you have done me. But the thing you desire may not be. Regardless of the foolish belief of the peoples of the outer world, or of the holy Thurn, or of the Ebon firstborn, I am not dead. While I live, my heart beats for but one woman, the incomparable Dejathoris, Princess of Helium. When death overtakes me, my heart shall have ceased to beat. But what comes after that I know not, and in that I am as wise as Matai Shang, master of life and death upon Barsoom, or ISSUS, goddess of life eternal." Fedor stood looking at me intently for a moment. No anger showed in her eyes this time, only a pathetic expression of hopeless sorrow. "I do not understand," she said, and turning, walked slowly in the direction of the door through which ISSUS and her retinue had passed. A moment later she had passed from my sight. End of chapter 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gods of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior. Chapter 10. The Prison Isle of SHADOR. In the outer gardens to which the guard now escorted me, I found Exedar surrounded by a crowd of noble blacks. They were reviling and cursing him. The men slapped his face. The women spat upon him. When I appeared, they turned their attentions toward me. "Ah!" cried one, "so this is the creature who overcame the great Exedar barehanded. Let us see how it was done." "Let him bind Thurid," suggested a beautiful woman, laughing. "Thurid is a noble dator. Let Thurid show the dog what it means to face a real man." "Yes, Thurid! Thurid!" cried a dozen voices. "Here he is now!" exclaimed another, and turning in the direction indicated, I saw a huge black weighed down with resplendent ornaments and arms advancing with noble and gallant bearing toward us. "What now?" he cried. "What would you of Thurid?" Quickly a dozen voices explained. Thurid turned toward Exedar, his eyes narrowing to two nasty slits. "Kalot," he hissed, "ever did I think you carried the heart of a Sorok in your putrid breast. Often have you bested me in the secret councils of ISSUS, but now in the field of war, where men are truly gauged, your scabby heart hath revealed its sores to all the world. Kalot, I spurn you with my foot." And with the words he turned to kick Exedar. My blood was up.
For minutes it had been boiling at the cowardly treatment that had been according this once powerful comrade, because he had fallen from the favor of ISSUS. I had no love for Exeter, but I cannot stand the sight of cowardly injustice and persecution without seeing red as through a haze of bloody mist, and doing things on the impulse of the moment that I presume I never should do after mature deliberation. I was standing close beside Exeter as Thurud swung his foot for the cowardly kick. The degraded debtor stood erect and motionless as a carven image. He was prepared to take whatever his former comrades had to offer in the way of insults and reproaches, and take them in manly silence and stoicism. But as Thurud's foot swung, so did mine, and I caught him a painful blow upon the shin bone that saved Exeter from this added ignominy. For a moment there was tense silence. Then Thurud, with a roar of rage, sprang for my throat, just as Exeter had done upon the deck of the cruiser. The results were identical. I ducked beneath his outstretched arms, and as he lunged past me planted a terrific right on the side of his jaw. The big fellow spun around like a top. His knees gave beneath him, and he crumpled to the ground at my feet. The blacks gazed in astonishment, first at the still form of the proud debtor lying there in the ruby dust of the pathway, then at me as though they could not believe that such a thing could be. "You asked me to bind Thurud," I cried. "Behold!" And then I stooped beside the prostrate form, tore the harness from it, and bound the fellow's arms and legs securely. "As you have done to Exeter, now do you likewise to Thurud. Take him before ISSUS, bound in his own harness, that she may see with her own eyes that there be one among you now who is greater than the firstborn." "Who are you?" whispered the woman who had first suggested that I attempt to bind Thurud. "I am a citizen of two worlds, Captain John Carter of Virginia, Prince of the House of Tardos Mors, Jeddak of Helium. Take this man to your goddess, as I have said, and tell her, too, that as I have done to Exeter and Thurud, so also can I do to the mightiest of her debtors. With naked hands, with long sword, or with short sword, I challenge the flower of her fighting men to combat." "Come," said the officer who was guarding me back to SHADOR. "My orders are imperative. There is to be no delay. Exeter, come you also." There was little of disrespect in the tone that the man used in addressing either Exeter or myself. It was evident that he felt less contempt for the former debtor since he had witnessed the ease with which I disposed of the powerful Thurud. That his respect for me was greater than it should have been for a slave was quite apparent from the fact that during the balance of the return journey he walked or stood always behind me, a drawn short sword in his hand. The return to the Sea of Omin was uneventful. We dropped down to the awful shaft in the same car that had brought us to the surface. There we entered the submarine, taking the long dive to the tunnel far beneath the upper world, then through the tunnel and up again to the pool from which we had had our first introduction to the wonderful passageway from Omin to the Temple of ISSUS. From the isle of the submarine we were transported on a small cruiser to the distant isle of SHADOR. Here we found a small stone prison and a guard of half a dozen blacks. There was no ceremony wasted in completing our incarceration. One of the blacks opened the door of the prison with a huge key. We walked in. The door closed behind us. The lock grated. And with the sound there swept over me again that terrible feeling of hopelessness that I had felt in the chamber of mystery in the golden cliff beneath the gardens of the holy Therns. Then Tars Tarkas had been with me, but now I was utterly alone in so far as friendly companionship was concerned. I fell to wondering about the fate of the great Thark and of his beautiful companion, the girl Thuvia. Even should they by some miracle have escaped and been received and spared by a friendly nation, what hope had I of the succour which I knew they would gladly extend if it lay in their power? They could not guess my whereabouts or my fate, for none on all Barsoom even dreamed of such a place as this, nor would it have advantaged me any had they known the exact location of my prison, for who could hope to penetrate to this buried sea in the face of the mighty navy of the firstborn? No, my case was hopeless. Well, I would make the best of it, and, rising, I swept aside the brooding despair that had been endeavoring to claim me. With the idea of exploring my prison, I started to look around. Exeter sat, with bowed head, upon a low stone bench near the center of the room in which we were. He had not spoken since ISSUS had degraded him. The building was roofless, the walls rising to a height of about 30 feet. Halfway up were a couple of small, heavily barred windows. The prison was divided into several rooms by partitions 20 feet high. There was no one in the room which we occupied, but 2 doors which led to other rooms were opened. I entered one of these rooms, but found it vacant. Thus I continued through several of the chambers until in the last one I found a young red Martian boy sleeping upon the stone bench which constituted the only furniture of any of the prison cells. Evidently he was the only other prisoner. As he slept I leaned over and looked at him. There was something strangely familiar about his face, and yet I could not place him. His features were very regular, and, like the proportions of his graceful limbs and body, beautiful in the extreme. He was very light in color for a red man, but in other respects he seemed a typical specimen of this handsome race. I did not awaken him, for sleep in prison is such a priceless boon that I have seen men transformed into raging brutes when robbed by one of their fellow prisoners of a few precious moments of it. Returning to my own cell, I found Exeter still sitting in the same position in which I had left him. "Man," I cried, "it will profit you nothing to mope thus. It were no disgrace to be bested by John Carter. You have seen that in the ease with which I accounted for Thurid. You knew it before when on the cruiser's deck you saw me slay 3 of your comrades." "I would that you had dispatched me at the same time," he said. "Come, come," I cried, "there is hope yet. Neither of us is dead. We are great fighters. Why not win to freedom?" He looked at me in amazement. "You know not of what you speak," he replied. "ISSUS is omnipotent. ISSUS is omniscient. She hears now the words you speak. She knows the thoughts you think. It is sacrilege even to dream of breaking her commands." "Rot, Exeter!" I ejaculated impatiently. He sprang to his feet in horror. "The curse of ISSUS will fall upon you," he cried. "In another instant you will be smitten down, writhing to your death in horrible agony." "Do you believe that, Exeter?" I asked. "Of course. Who would dare doubt?" "I doubt. Yes, and further I deny," I said. "Why, Exeter, you tell me that she even knows my thoughts. The red men have all had that power for ages. And another wonderful power. They can shut their minds so that none may read their thoughts. I learned the first secret years ago. The other I never had to learn, since upon all Barsoom is none who can read what passes in the secret chambers of my brain. Your goddess cannot read my thoughts, nor can she read yours when you are out of sight, unless you will it. Had she been able to read mine, I am afraid that her pride would have suffered a rather severe shock when I turned at her command to gaze upon the holy vision of her radiant face." "What do you mean?" he whispered in an affrighted voice, so low that I could scarcely hear him. "I mean that I thought her the most repulsive and vilely hideous creature my eyes ever had rested upon." For a moment he eyed me in horror-stricken amazement, and then with a cry of "Blasphemer!" he sprang upon me. I did not wish to strike him again, nor was it necessary, since he was unarmed and therefore quite harmless to me. As he came I grasped his left wrist with my left hand, and, swinging my right arm about his left shoulder, caught him beneath the chin with my elbow, and bore him backward across my thigh. There he hung helpless for a moment, glaring up at me in impotent rage. "Exeter," I said, "let us be friends. For a year, possibly, we may be forced to live together in the narrow confines of this tiny room. I am sorry to have offended you, but I could not dream that one who had suffered from cruel injustice of ISSUS still could believe her divine. I will say a few more words, Exeter, with no intent to wound your feelings further, but rather that you may give thought to the fact that while we live we are still more the arbiters of our own fate than is any god. ISSUS, you see, has not struck me dead, nor is she rescuing her faithful Exeter from the clutches of the unbeliever who defamed her fair beauty. No, Exeter, your ISSUS is a mortal old woman, once out of her clutches, and she cannot harm you. With your knowledge of this strange land, and my knowledge of the outer world, 2 such fighting men as you and I should be able to win our way to freedom. Even though we died in the attempt, would not our memories be fairer than as though we remained in servile fear to be butchered by a cruel and unjust tyrant? Call her goddess or mortal as you will." As I finished, I raised Exeter to his feet and released him. He did not renew the attack upon me, nor did he speak. Instead, he walked toward the bench, and sinking down upon it, remained lost in deep thought for hours. A long time afterward I heard a soft sound at the doorway leading to one of the other apartments, and looking up beheld the red Martian youth gazing intently at us. "Kaor!" I cried, after the red Martian manner of greeting. "Kaor!" he replied. "What do you here?" "I await my death, I presume," I replied with a weary smile. He too smiled, a brave and winning smile. "I also," he said. "Mine will come soon. I looked upon the radiant beauty of ISSUS nearly a year since. It has always been a source of keen wonder to me that I did not drop dead at the first sight of that hideous countenance. And her belly! By my first ancestor! But never was there so grotesque a figure in all the universe. That they should call such a one goddess of life eternal, goddess of death, mother of the nearer moon, and 50 other equally impossible titles is quite beyond me." "How came you here?" I asked. "It is very simple. I was flying a one-man air scout far to the south when the brilliant idea occurred to me that I should like to search for the lost Sea of Chorus, which tradition places near to the South Pole. I must have inherited from my father a wild lust for adventure as well as a hollow where my bump of reverence should be. I had reached the area of eternal ice when my prop propeller jammed, and I dropped to the ground to make repairs. Before I knew it the air was black with flyers, and 100 of those first-born devils were leaping to the ground all about me. With drawn swords they made for me, but before I went down beneath them they had tasted of the steel of my father's sword, and I had given such an account of myself as I know would have pleased my sire had he lived to witness it." "Your father is dead?" I asked. "He died before the shell broke to let me step out into a world that has been very good to me. But for the sorrow that I have never the honor to know my father, I have been very happy. My only sorrow now is that my mother must mourn me as she has for 10 long years mourned my father." "Who was your father?" I asked. He was about to reply when the outer door of our prison opened and a burly guard entered and ordered him to his own quarters for the night, locking the door after him as he passed through into the further chamber. "It is ISSUS's wish that you two be confined in the same room," said the guard when he had returned to our cell. "This cowardly slave of a slave is to serve you well," he said to me, indicating Exedar with a wave of his hand. "If he does not, you are to beat him into submission. It is ISSUS's wish that you heap upon him every indignity and degradation of which you can conceive." With these words he left us. Exedar still sat with his face buried in his hands. I walked to his side and placed my hand upon his shoulder. "Exedar," I said, "you have heard the commands of ISSUS, but you need not fear that I should attempt to put them into execution. You are a brave man, Exedar. It is your own affair if you wish to be persecuted and humiliated. But were I you, I should assert my manhood and defy my enemies." "I have been thinking very hard, John Carter," he said, "of all the new ideas you gave me a few hours since. Little by little I have been piecing together the things that you said which sounded blasphemous to me then, with the things that I have seen in my past life and dared not even think about for fear of bringing down upon me the wrath of ISSUS. I believe now that she is a fraud, no more divine than you or I. More, I am willing to concede that the firstborn are no holier than the holy Therns, nor the holy Therns more holy than the red men. The whole fabric of our religion is based on superstitious belief in lies that have been foisted upon us for ages by those directly above us, to whose personal profit and aggrandizement it was to have us continue to believe as they wished us to believe. I am ready to cast off the ties that have bound me. I am ready to defy ISSUS herself. But what will it avail us? Be the firstborn gods or mortals, they are a powerful race, and we are as fast in their clutches as though we were already dead. There is no escape." "I have escaped from bad plights in the past, my friend," I replied. "Nor while life is in me shall I despair of escaping from the Isle of SHADOR and the Sea of Omin." "But we cannot escape even from the 4 walls of our prison," urged Exedar. "Test this flint-like surface," he cried, smiting the solid rock that confined us, "and look upon this polished surface. None could cling to it to reach the top." I smiled. "That is the least of our troubles, Exedar," I replied. "I will guarantee to scale the wall and take you with me, if you will help with your knowledge of the customs here to appoint the best time for the attempt, and guide me to the shaft that lets from the dome of this abysmal sea to the light of God's pure air above. Night time is the best, and offers the only slender chance we have, for then men sleep, and only a dozing watch nods in the tops of the battleship. No watch is kept upon the cruisers in the smaller craft. The watchers upon the larger vessels see to all about them. It is night now." "But," I exclaimed, "it is not dark. How can it be night, then?" He smiled. "You forget," he said, "that we are far below ground. The light of the sun never penetrates here. There are no moons and no stars reflected in the bosom of Omin. The phosphorant light you now see pervading this great subterranean vault emanates from the rocks that form its dome. It is always thus upon Omin, just as the billows are always as you see them, rolling, ever rolling over a windless sea. At the appointed hour of night, upon the world above, the men whose duties hold them here sleep, but the light is ever the same." "It will make escape more difficult," I said, and then I shrugged my shoulders. For what, pray, is the pleasure of doing any easy thing? "Let us sleep on it tonight," said Exeter. "A plan may come with our awakening." So we threw ourselves upon the hard stone floor of our prison and slept the sleep of tired men. End of chapter 10.